Welcome to Scary Stories. This time we've got two scary Dogman or Werewolf stories, each beginning at that time on screen. Let's get started with
Dogman in the basement. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I recently was walking my dog in the park, and a chilly breeze took us both by surprise. A nearby fellow dog walker made a comment to the effect that winter was coming. I got a shiver all over as the stranger's comment brought back some dark memories from my past of the time that the cold weather inspired a dog-headed creature taller than me to stake out our basement as his winter hibernation kill cave. It was years ago now when this happened, and we've moved from that house since then. But I still shake all over whenever I think of that creature that most of you call the Dogman. When I was a kid, I used to get excited with the first 80-degree day of the spring because it meant that summer vacation was coming soon. In the same way, I'd get excited the first day I felt cold without a jacket because that meant Christmas was coming. My mother used to stress out over the coming winter though, because it cost money to heat the house, and because the warmth that she and my father were paying for would attract mice to come in from the cold and live with us. Now that I'm an adult with my own house, we haven't just had a mouse or two sneak inside. We've had our basement broken into by the North American upright walking canid. I want to say, even before I get into the details about the cryptid creature itself, that my wife, who I'll call Zelda, and I were not fans of real-life monster shows when this happened to us. In fact, we only learned that all this was a thing as the problem was already being cleaned up, hopefully for good. If we had known then what we know now, I think we would have handled things differently, including collecting samples of the animal's shed hair, as well as inviting both mainstream and alternative scientists and researchers to have a look at the situation before we had the work done to protect our home from being attacked again in this manner. Now, when this happened, we were living in Kentucky, which is where we're both originally from, and where we both hope to retire to, if retirement ever actually becomes possible for either one of us. It cost almost half as much to redo our basement as it had cost to buy the house in the first place, but I don't think it got us very much more for the place when we sold it. I mean, you can tell the buyer that you shored up the walls and floor of the basement with layers of steel in between layers of concrete, but they'll only ask you why you did that. If you then explain that you went through all that trouble to prevent 7-foot-tall canine-headed feral man-eating monster men from breaking into the basement from below, then the buyer is probably going to have already left before you even finish that sentence. So it was a necessary expense, but we had to sort of downplay it in order to sell the house at all. No doubt about it, the Dogman cost us a lot of money. Now let me tell you what he did that screwed our lives up. So this would have been in the mid to late 2000s, somewhere between 2004 and 2009. It was a cold winter near us. That's all I remember. Zelda and I had the same jobs, same friends, same VHS store that we rented from, which became a DVD store, and same Chinese food restaurant near us during those years. And most days were indistinguishable from most others when I think back on that time. We were very content, but nothing ever happened. We were just so happy to watch every obscure movie in the video store and to read fanzines and websites about what other obscure movies we should search out that we just sort of entertained ourselves all the time. There was a period of abundance for us, and we sort of went to blissful sleep for a long time there. Then, along came the Dogman to wake us up. I guess I mean that literally. The first time we noticed the presence of the Beastman was when it woke my wife, Zelda, up. She then woke me up and said there was something thumping around in the basement. She woke me in the middle of a dream, and I was a little disoriented. I grabbed my Louisville Slugger, and I went to head downstairs to deal with the situation when Zelda insisted I call the police instead. I did as she asked, but when they asked me what the problem was, I had to put my wife on the phone since I didn't really know. The cops are the ones who woke me up the next time when they rang our doorbell like it was a pinball machine. I let them in, and they investigated the basement. I was pretty certain that they'd find a neighbor's cat that snuck in, or something like that. But instead they called me and Zelda down to the cellar to show us something. What they showed us was a hole in one corner of the room. Since that hole was partially on the wall and partially on the floor, both of which were made of stone and concrete, this was obviously concerning to us. The cops told us that the entire neighborhood was built over a cave system, and that sometimes animals can gnaw their way up into people's homes from those caves. I got a calling card for a relative of one of the officers who happened to specialize in this type of basement repair. I must say that was quite convenient. Since this cop seemed to have seen this sort of thing before, I took him aside and asked him what he thought had snuck through that hole. It wasn't even large enough for me to stick my head through, so I was visualizing a rat or a cat. The officer chuckled and said a rat could fit through a hole the size of a quarter, while a skinny cat who was motivated enough could squeeze through cracks so small that your eyes wouldn't believe it. With a hole the size of the one in our basement, the officer explained, we could actually get animals large enough to pose a danger to myself and my wife coming up through the tunnels that I now understood were everywhere, beneath our feet. And with only a little bit more widening, that hole there could probably allow burglars to slip up inside as well. Zelda and I had been convinced. We either needed to find the money to shore up that basement floor, or we needed to move out of there. So, we contacted the relative of the cop. He came out to give us an estimate on fixing our basement. My wife unfortunately was upstairs when this next thing happened and did not see it. But the construction guy and I went down to the basement, turned a corner, and there, its eyes glowing in the darkness, was a man taller than either one of us, covered in fur instead of clothing, legs and head like a canine, on an upright bipedal body that in most ways struck me as humanoid, not animal. The creature was growling at us before I even laid eyes on it, and I remember saying something like, "Whoa," and backing off, my hands held palm outward as I took a few steps backward. The worker guy stayed perfectly still, and I figured I'd better copy him. He seemed to have seen something like this monster somewhere before. Maybe there are more Dogman underneath Kentucky than most of us really know. In either case, I know they're there, because I saw it with my own two non-glowing eyes. I would like to hit the pause button on the action for a second, to point out or underline that we were dealing with a real physical animal. Sometimes people have told me that I must have encountered an archetype, or something paranormal. And they use all these words that I don't know if I want to learn the meanings of. If other people say that they've seen dogmen who turned out to be ghosts, or turned out to be space aliens, or demons, or devils, or hallucinations, or holograms, or projections, or psychic experiences, then I say more power to 'em. But in the same sense, I would hope that my feelings could be respected when I insist to you that what we encountered in that basement was an animal of some sort, a physical animal that maneuvered itself through a crack into our basement. It did not teleport there, and it did not vanish in a puff of smoke either. It was real, and physical, and alive. It took up space, it breathed air, and was covered in fur, which it shed all over everything. The creature was making this face that one of my old dogs used to make when he was upset but too scared to do anything about it. He was baring his teeth and making little moaning sounds in between growling, but sometimes I would notice its glowing eyes seemed to be looking up or to the side. Even in the midst of this terrifying display that made my knees shake and wobble, I could see with my own eyes that the dog was actually frightened about the idea of having to engage in battle with us. He was blustering, but he was hoping we would go away. Even though I knew for a fact that I was right about this, I held perfectly still. Both of us humans did. Even if that big dogman was afraid that we might be able to take it, I don't think either of us felt such a fantasy was realistic. The dogman barked loudly, which made me want to cut and run. The worker guy grabbed me and held me in place. My wife came halfway down the stairs asking whose dog was in the basement, but she stopped when the basement man waved at her to be quiet. I watched as the dogman retreated and wiggled through the tiny hole back into the tunnel system below. It took maybe 3 or 4 seconds, like sucking some spaghetti into your mouth. I don't know if the creature displaced bones or what, but that dogman was taller than I was, and yet somehow fit itself through that hole that I could not fit my own skull through. I watched it happen, but it was so fast that I can't even tell you what I watched. All I know is I had that worker guy bring people out and start work immediately that very evening. They had to tear away part of the floor in order to put it back in a reinforced manner. When they did so, we could see in 5 directions down different twisting natural tunnels, all of which seemed to be leading to our basement. That's an exaggeration, but it's also basically true. We had a lot of expensive work to get done before I would begin to feel safe being inside that home again, but we somehow found a way to make it all happen. When Zelda's job forced us to move just before the pandemic, at least one of our other neighbors had also had to have their basement redone. Still, our dream is that we can somehow afford to retire and move back to that area, preferably back to that very house, if fate allows. I mean, after all that expensive work we had done, at least we know we'd never have to worry about the dogman in the basement. Werewolf versus Dogman on Wolf Drive, or the Dogman of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid in the 60s through the 1990s when I was a young adult, we used to tell stories about a werewolf in Kalamazoo, Michigan that would get seen on Wolf Drive or WG Avenue, which we used to call Werewolf Growl Avenue, and other nicknames along those lines. By we, I mean a small circle of my family and friends. My 2 brothers and my sister were in the group interested in our local wolf-headed man, but our parents made it clear they disapproved of us discussing the topic or claiming that we had seen the beast. There are few better ways to create a rift with somebody than telling them they're bad for having just seen something. As a consequence, we shied away from our parents and family events, preferring to spend our time with our friends who had either seen the dogman themselves, or who were at least open-minded and willing to believe the rest of us. Like, you didn't have to agree with us to be in our gang, but you did have to accept that none of us were lying. We were all always telling the truth as we understood it. Whether we actually understood what was happening, that's something else that I suppose is open to question. All of us had seen the wolf, the upright one, I mean, but never when we were together. That caused us to want to be together more. We felt a sense of safety from the beast when we gathered in any numbers. The one time that I saw the dogman or wolfman, I was 14, I guess, and my uncle, who didn't see it, was driving me home from band practice after school. It was just at the end of dusk, or the beginning of the night, and it was the hardest to make out detail of the entire day. The lights and the darks all seemed sort of gray, and I found myself squinting almost as much as I might if the sun were super bright. Then, dark gray against light gray, there it was. The Dogman. It was a man, all right, running on its hind legs through the misty early evening. It reminded me of old drawings I had seen of the comic book superhero The Flash, running at high speed, his feet coming up so high that he almost kicked his own butt. I mean the 1940s Flash, with the metal helmet like Mercury, not the later one with the mask. The Dogman ran faster than a human, or at least he seemed to when I got that one brief sighting. But as I said before, we all saw him. All my friends and siblings. My parents never did admit to seeing him, but they wouldn't talk about any of this, under any circumstances. They seemed to feel that discussing the Dogman attracted the Dogman. One of our cousins claimed that she was in the passenger seat of her parents' car while her dad changed the back left tire. They were pulled off onto the grass on the side of Wolf Drive, over by one of those farms over there. She claimed that a man-sized creature walked on up out of the crops and stopped when he saw her in the car. Her father was on the opposite side, so neither of them saw each other, only the werewolf and the girl. She said she studied it until it returned to the farm, and what she saw was a short-snouted creature that really looked like the Wolfman from an old black and white movie. She couldn't recall if it was wearing any clothing at all, which seems odd to me. I mean, either he was wearing something or he wasn't. Wouldn't you sort of notice either way? At any rate, she was the only one of us who reported that kind of a Wolfman. The rest of us had seen something with a far lower forehead and a far longer wolf or dog-like snout. The latter were taller than the human-sized one that the girl told us about. We all wondered if there really were two different kinds of dogmen in that area, or if the girl, the only witness of the shorter and shorter-nosed creature, was just bonkers and out to lunch. So as we grew up, some of us paired off and started dating, as you do. One night I was in the back seat with my girlfriend, and one of my buddies was in the front with his, and we were parked off the side of Wolf Drive, just sort of going to the drive-in, without any movie showing. We were over by the farm with the rows and rows of plants growing just on the other side of the trees, which separated those crops from Wolf Drive. I kept thinking I was hearing something, but it sounded to me like an elephant trumpeting its horn, and so I disregarded it as possibly a crazy person out in the night or something. The sound got a little louder each time, though, and then suddenly we could feel the ground shake underneath us. Not in the way that it would during an earthquake, but rather in that way that the ground shakes when something incredibly heavy is bouncing in your direction. We all looked up from what we were doing too late and saw the dog-headed giant, its eyes burning yellowish red, furiously bursting from the farm upward toward the road. It was then that I remembered the story that girl had told years earlier of seeing the Dogman staring into the car at her. It was right where we were parked. The thing is, this one seemed to be chasing something, and at first I wasn't sure what or who. The girls flipped out, screaming so loudly that I thought I was going to go deaf. I yelled at my buddy to get us out of there, and he started to begin the process of preparing himself to get that engine started and return us to the blacktop that we had pulled off of. Before we were anywhere near ready to drive off, however, another large man-sized beast crashed out of the low branches of a nearby tree, landing hard on the ground between the first, much larger Dogman and the car we were parked inside of. It took some time to get a clear view of that one, but it had a far smaller snout than the larger one, and a much larger forehead. This one looked more like a human, at least around the face, and it was more the size of a human male too. The coloring of its fur was a reddish brown, which is a fairly normal human shade. The larger one had a jackal head with almost no forehead. It seemed all animal, all monster, all appetite. It did not appear to be something you could reason with. That big blue-gray dog-headed humanoid was just living ferocity. The two chased themselves around in a circle, sometimes circling around us, sometimes in front of us. My friend in the driver's seat started fretting that even once he got the engine started, there was no safe place to drive. Back out onto the farm, the two beasts would race on all fours. Crashing back through the trees, they would come on their hind legs further down the road. I saw the larger gray Dogman climb an embankment, only to double back and use the height advantage to leap out onto his smaller opponent. The two rolled across the blacktop, and my friend carped the diem, zooming and booming us up and out of that little lover's lane gone wrong. Once we barreled past the two wrestling monsters, the three of us cheered our driver. I was so happy, as in, extremely relieved. I turned around to see the monsters for what I hoped would be one last time, and I gasped so hard I swallowed air into my stomach. They weren't rolling over each other on the road, battling to the death. No, these two seemed to have put aside their differences and decided to pursue a common enemy. And that enemy, it seemed, was our car. Now 3 of us were all screeching at our driver to speed up. Nobody had to scream at the dogmen or werewolves or whatever they were. They sped up under their own power, and for their own reasons. So the 2 canines pursued us, with the dog-headed one in the lead. As we headed into the turn onto where the road becomes called WG instead of Wolf, we were only about 1.5 car lengths ahead of the lead dogman. After the right turn, the girls and I stared out the back, waiting to see the werewolves make that turn after us. We never saw them again that night. It certainly felt paranormal or supernatural to us. Then again, maybe they just turned away into the woods at that point. Or maybe they went back to fighting each other. Maybe it wasn't so mysterious after all. Or maybe it was one of the world's greatest mysteries. All I know is I'm glad that's all I've got to tell you about the time that we saw Werewolf vs. Dogman on Wolf Drive.
Find that link in the description, honey.
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.